Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mind Matters. On today's show, we're going to break down our conception of the universe. It's no small task, really.
We're going to do it.
But we're going to do it. We're going to do it in an hour and a half or an hour and 20 minutes. But most of human history is characterized by just competing different worldviews about the cosmos, how it came to be, why it exists, how animals came to possess their particular characteristics, how people came to possess our own peculiar characteristics, why there is life, and what role there is to having a mind or having physical characteristics. So on today's show, we're going to just kind of break it all down and look at it in a really philosophical and abstract way and kind of weigh out what it means to live in the universe that we live in. Just what does it mean to have material bodies, to have a mind? What should the center of gravity be in our philosophical outlook? Should we put emphasis on matter and science, the scientific materialism, or should we place emphasis on mind? And if we do, there's a number of different ways of conceptualizing how mind came to exist in the cosmos. Is mind the ultimate absolute existence? Everything exists within an ultimate mind? Or did mind come to exist in terms of just the absolute physical substrate? It has consciousness, and then in some bizarre way happened to evolve into more and more grand schemes of consciousness and existence. Mm-hmm. So on today's show, that's what we're going to tackle.
Well, I want to read something to start out with. This is from the book The Idea of the World by Bernardo Kastrup. We talked a bit about Kastrup's work in a couple previous shows based on some articles that he wrote, but we've been reading the book lately to get more in depth into his ideas and his argument. And right in one of the first chapters, I just want to read a short paragraph to kind of lay the ground on why it's important and kind of go on from there. So he writes, while advances in technology, enabled by the predictive models of science, have influenced early 21st century culture more than anything else, questions of ontology loom large in the contemporary psyche. What is the nature of reality? What is the essence of phenomenal consciousness, and how does it relate to matter? Our tentative answers to these questions color, if not outright determine, our views of life's meaning, thereby underlying every aspect of our existence. So that's really why it's important, because the beliefs we have about the nature of the world will influence our decisions, our actions, and our character. Because that's what kind of sets the vision and the ideal of the meaning of life in our psyches. This relates back to topics we've covered on multiple previous shows, even just the last one, where we're talking about like belief in God, where we looked at Jordan Peterson's answer to that, and basically like what belief entails. Well, if you keep in mind what we talked about last week about the nature of belief and how belief does. Belief is like inextricably intertwined with our actions and with what we actually do. Well, we're going to have to get a good handle on what we actually believe then, because and we can look at it from two directions too. Like we can look at our actions and how our actions suggest a deeper belief, or we can analyze the beliefs directly or try our best to, and then see what those beliefs entail and how that would play out. So the options, well, like you said, there are several options, and there's a whole history of worldviews and ways of looking at the world and thinking about it. And like Kastrup mentions here about the predictive power of science and technology, that's really what's dominating the worldview today, I think. And that's rooted, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, in like the history of thought for like the past 300 years. Like we're living in no matter what time you look at, like in all of history, you're going to have an entire history before that has shaped and conditioned the worldview of that time. So our time is no different. But there have been several important like things that were introduced into the thought world of humanity, particular in like Western Europe and like the English speaking world, but in Germany, Italy, France, all of Western Europe, and the thought, the collective thought of all those interactions and groups that have basically played an integral role in forming the way that we think today, even if we're not aware of it. Just like if you go even further, like the Bible has been probably the most influential book on like Western consciousness, even for people who have never read it. They're still influenced because the like those thought patterns and the like the values and maybe non-values that have gotten passed down through the generations, they all influence us in one way or another, even if we aren't aware of it. So on the one hand, it pays to become aware of it as best as possible, to see, well, why do I think the way that I think? Why do I make what assumptions am I making? And then how does that influence my life and the way I interact with the world? So one of the big critiques that Kastrup has is of physicalism, as he calls it. We've usually used the word like materialism, but this view of reality as fundamentally physical. And of course, in the previous show that we did, we touched on some of the reasons why why that is like a bad idea. It doesn't seem to be true, because maybe just to get into one of the criticisms of physicalism that Kastrup gives, and it's pretty similar to ones we've given on the show before, is that like matter, when thought of as physical, is a mental abstraction. And what does that mean? What's a mental abstraction? Well, if you think about the daily life of a scientist, what they do is they observe something. They are experiencing some phenomenon and trying to categorize it and trying to figure it out. So they've got these experiences of the world that are ordered in a particular way. Like things seem to happen in this ordered way. It's like that's how all like the entire history of science has developed, is people discovering like regularities in nature and things that happen in ways that can be predicted and described, often mathematically. So you have this stuff in the world that you're observing, and you have like these objects, physical objects that, or we'll leave the word out for now, not physical, just objects. You have these objects that interact and behave in certain ways. And when looked at with this mindset, with this scientific mindset, you discover that these things can be measured, for instance. And like if you look at physics is primarily mathematical. It's describing the mathematical relations and interactions of these things. So gravity, you can describe gravity in an equation that maps to reality. It predicts and it describes like events that have been observed and that happen. And you find this everywhere, whether it's electromagnetism or even down to like quantum mechanics or momentum and flight, and all these things can be described mathematically. So now you have this stuff that behaves according to these mathematical rules, and other values like the values of mass and like the values of momentum. Like, so not necessarily a formula, but just a single value, like a number. And you can have a complete, like, or as close as complete as we're able, description of reality in math, like written down on paper. So the idea that matter is all that exists is essentially holding up that piece of paper with all those mathematical descriptions and all the possible values and saying that is reality. That is what matter is. So the idea of matter as a stuff that can be essentially and completely described in terms of like values and like mathematical relations, that is an abstraction, because it is like it has been separated out from our experience and reduced to mathematics and to this narrow field of reason, of rationality. And then the ontological statement, the statement about the nature of being that entails for some people is the doctrine of materialism or physicalism, that is all there is to reality, is that abstract description of matter. So matter is only the numbers, the math, the mathematical interactions, and what we actually experience about it, like the shape, color, and pressure, and all of these senses and like sight, like the images that we have. All of those things aren't really important. Those are just kind of byproducts of the real thing. Mm-hmm. But the oddity about that and why it doesn't really work is that, well, it started from perception. It started from an actual experience. And so to reduce that experience to something that was that was born within that experience seems like, there's something very wrong going on there. It's like, actually, no, you had the experience of it. There's something fundamental about the experience that can then be described using these narrow fields, like using mathematics and physics, which are obviously important and obviously have something to do with the nature of the things that you are perceiving. But seems to be more to it than that. For instance, there's the fact that you are experiencing and able to experience those things in the first place. From a mathematical description of reality, there's nothing in that math that can even point to or suggest even the idea of experience, of consciousness, of perception. It's like that is something that can only be experienced. A complete description of it can only be experienced. Like it can't exist on its own in some way. It's just this abstraction that has been force fit and into a complete description of reality, but that complete description is this segment of reality that can't possibly describe what even led to those observations and those reasonable and rational conclusions in the first place.
So Kastrup tries to make a lot of distinctions between the relationship between mind and matter, and like you said earlier in the description, Corey, there is, our consciousness, our awareness is, some people think is the very substratum, the very basis for which everything can be perceived or represented, including physical matter. So we're just getting our feet kind of wet with his terminology, but there are a lot of important distinctions that he's setting up for us in terminology that at least to myself is quite new. So one of those terms, because I think we'll be repeating it again here as we describe some of his material, and you'll hear it in context, so that with repetition it's gonna hopefully sink in a little bit. But Kastrup uses the term idealism, which is the attempt to explain matter in terms of the mind, and I think that's partially what you were getting at, Harrison, is that there is this way of viewing reality through what it is, through conceiving of what the mind is, and I think something else you were getting at was something that it's actually a pretty famous term. He didn't coin it. The hard problem of consciousness. So I wanted to read a little bit of a description of what that is exactly, because I think that's a kind of a way from which to view a lot of the distinctions that Kastrup is trying to make in his book. This is from a site called Scholarpedia. The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining the relationship between physical phenomena, such as brain processes and experience. For example, phenomenal consciousness or mental states, events with phenomenal qualities. Why are physical processes ever accompanied by experience? And why does a given physical process generate the specific experience it does? Why an experience of red rather than green, for example? So I think to help understand this hard problem of consciousness, we might also compare it to what an easy problem of consciousness might be. The hard problem contrasts with so-called easy problems, such as explaining how the brain integrates information, categorizes and discriminates environmental stimuli, or focuses attention. Such phenomenon are functionally definable. So if you've ever read anything on neuroscience or have heard any of our shows on psychopathy or have ever studied the brain in any amount of detail, and in even a very basic detail, there are some processes that we can ascribe to the biological workings of certain parts of the brain, certain associations, certain things we know have a connection. So that's the easy problem of consciousness. To continue, roughly put, they are definable in terms of what they allow a subject to do. So, for example, if mechanisms that explain how the brain integrates information are discovered, then the first of the easy problems listed would be solved. The same point applies to all other easy problems. They concern specifying mechanisms that explain how functions are performed. For the easy problems, once the relevant mechanisms are well understood, there is little or no explanatory work left to do. Experience does not seem to fit this explanatory model, though some reductionists argue that on reflection it does. Although experience is associated with a variety of functions, explaining how those functions are performed would still seem to leave important questions unanswered. We would still want to know why their performance is accompanied by experience, and why this or that kind of experience rather than of another kind. So, for example, when we find something that plays the causal role of pain, something that is caused by nerve stimulation and that causes recoil and avoidance, we can still ask why the particular experience of hurting, as opposed to, say, itching, is associated with that role. Such problems are hard problems. So maybe that might be, if you want to comment on that as a jumping off point, those hard problems versus those easy problems in conscious distinction to the hard problems. How it is that that there are these more subjective perceptions that can't be explained necessarily by the physical, well-known biological mechanisms of the brain or the mind.
Okay, so just a couple things came to my mind when you're talking about the hard problems and the easy problems. One, I was thinking specifically in terms of the hard problem of consciousness. There seems to be a couple of different ways that you can approach the problem. Kastrup's is the most novel and interesting one that I've seen, but just to start with the more mainstream ways of approaching it. One is to say that the problem of explaining conscious subjective experience in terms of physical reality is a problem, a hard problem, but one that we can solve at some point in time once we have the proper mathematical models, once science has run its course. Basically, the idea that, yes, it's a problem that we can't solve now, but at some point we'll be able to solve it in terms of, physical reality. And another one is to say that it's not a hard problem at all because consciousness doesn't exist. There is no problem. The problem itself is an illusion. And I think, that one you can just categorically state is absurd, but it is also illustrative of how degrading, I guess, some of these beliefs can be. If you think that experience itself doesn't exist, then what is your experience? What is other people's experience?
What's your experience of that idea?
Yeah, when you think about another human being and you look at them as though their experience doesn't exist and they don't matter, then where is human dignity in that? That's just a practical consideration. But at the same time, when you think about the people that you love, and hold dear, doesn't such a sentiment seem like an assault on them? That their experience doesn't matter. They're just unconscious robots versus any other, more, something more valuable, some way of seeing people that's more valuable.
But not only is everyone else a robot, so are you.
Yeah.
So that's getting back to that first quote that I read from the book about why these things are important. Because if you truly believe that, well, first of all, you can't truly believe that because on some level you are experiencing and you're aware that you're experiencing. Like even if you're reading a book by like Richard Dawkins or something, and they're convincing you that you don't exist, like your consciousness doesn't exist or something, or that reality is reducible to these very like simplistic and abstract ideas. But if you think about how that might affect yourself, like on the emotional level in your interactions with others, well, if you're trying to convince yourself on some level that you essentially don't exist, well, that can only lead to like nihilism of various kinds, or like the expressions of nihilism. Like things won't matter. You won't be able to find meaning in your life, because the meaning in your life is that you're worthless and basically might not even exist, or you might be the only thing that exists, and like everything is just this confusing mass of like the world is just this solipsistic hallucination or something like that. It's like there's no order that you can bring to the world and your interaction with the world and your interaction with other people when you've got this idea that is so like anti-world, you know, and like anti-you and anti-other people. It's like anti-human, and more than that, and less than that. It's like that nothing really exists. Nothing is real in some sense. So that's where I think these things go, and I think that you know, that progression of the last 300 years or so of how these ideas have developed, I think that that has reached this point in our culture today where that's the reason why there are so many problems, like mental health problems like depression and suicide, and just this anomie and this lack of meaning. It's like it may come in cycles, and it may not be like just the result of those 300 years. There may be specific things that have happened that are contributing, and there probably are, like in just the last generation. But they all contribute, and they all play their part in like the creation of this lack of understanding, and this lack of meaning, and this lack of seeing the world as a place of meaning. But getting back to the hard problem of consciousness, it's like Kastrup and others, like David Ray Griffin, would argue that it's not a problem in the thing in the sense that the philosophers that think about it think it's a problem, because it's based on an assumption, and it's based on what they call like a category error. So you're saying, oh well, what you're essentially asking is, how can something that has experience come out of something that we know doesn't have experience? And well, the problem there is that we don't know that something doesn't have experience. We don't even know that something generates consciousness. It's an assumption that is built into the question that the brain must somehow produce consciousness. Well, what if it doesn't? You know, what Kastrup, for instance, is saying, well, what if it's the other way around? What if like the experience and consciousness is fundamental, and the brain, like the physical, is just an expression of that consciousness somehow, an experience of consciousness? That's the way we perceive the excitations of of that which experiences. That's how Kastrup puts it in the book, like the field of consciousness or experience. You can look at it from the other angle, and when you look at it from the other angle, the question disappears because you get rid of those assumptions. And that like that assumption, the category error is like mixing up these levels of abstraction, as Kastrup puts it. So you've got like this, like the one, like the immediate sense of experience that you have, and then from that you abstract that there is such a thing as matter that exists independent of your experience, and that is completely described as this mindless, like material stuff. That in itself is an abstraction. So you're saying, how can what we experience be the result and the effect of something of this matter that we have like abstracted from our experience? And so what Kastrup's saying is like, you can't do that. It's like you have to apply on the same level of abstraction. So like the easy questions are the questions that you deal with on the same level of abstraction. So what's going on in the brain? Oh, what is that brain correlated with? You know, how does one neuron affect these other neurons, and what are the pathways, and like all these things that we can seemingly just observe and answer questions like in that domain. It's like, well, it is a domain. It's like, how do we explain things in this limited sphere? So if we limit things to material, to matter, to the material realm, well, we can explain material things in terms of other material things, because it seems to be this coherent system. But what the nature is of that coherent system, we don't know, and we can't explain, and we'd be quite arrogant to assume that we have all the answers. And that's pretty much like the history of this kind of philosophy, is this arrogance to say, oh, well, we know what all that is. That is matter, and here's what we've described matter as, and that's everything. But
I really liked Kastrup describes it as like you imagine a painter who paints this picture, a self-portrait, and then after he's done, he just points at it and says, "I'm the portrait." That's basically what these scientists have been doing, and it kind of reeks like desperation too, because it's like there's no other answer out there. It's like this is the only thing that we have at this point in time that makes sense for whatever reason. There's historical reasons for that, but it seems like this despair of, it seems like a mental illness in some way, some sort of disturbance in the psyche that just grabs onto this portrait that's created of nature, of physical reality, and just clings onto it like because there's no other. There's no other rock in the stream to hold on to prevent yourself from being torn downstream. Mm-hmm. But another thing that I thought was interesting, like you were saying about the correlations between brain activity and experience, and Kastrup points out that is also can be seen as evidence that consciousness exists in matter. Because that is our personal experience. There's only two real ways that we know of experience existing. It's our personal experience and our theories of minds of other people, based upon our personal experience and our growth of awareness of an empathy of what other people are like, and then the actual neural substrate that when you peel back all the layers of the onion, that you can see that this is correlated with a certain emotion or a certain, if this hardware is correlated with this certain feature of the human personality, you damage this hardware and that's damaged. And you have to accept that, yes, consciousness isn't in and of itself you can't, as a human being, just pretend that the universe is a different way. You have to live by these physical laws, and these physical laws are best described in terms of this kind of physical science, just natural science, being able to investigate these periodic rhythms, the laws of nature, so to speak. But at the same time, that way of viewing the world doesn't work when you take it out of that and try and start applying it like a man who sees or has a hammer to a man who has a hammer, everything is a nail. It's the similar with like Marxism. So I've got this theory about economics, now everything is economics. Mm-hmm. Or Darwinism, I've got this theory about natural selection, so now everything is natural selection. It's just this way of viewing the world that takes religious instinct and without actual religious thought, religious philosophy, substitute it, because the quote is, nature abhors a vacuum, right? It's like, instead of just leaving the mind to itself and thinking in terms of abstract, philosophical concepts about, the nature of the universe and, all of these things that Kastrup is talking about, just thinking about them in their own logical way, all of this materialism just gets in and just gums up all the gears, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it just reminded me of another thing that Kastrup says, kind of in support of his whole idea, and that is that we're all kind of dissociated
alters.
Alters, yeah. Which was a funny way of putting it. An alter being someone with a split personality, who has these alters or multiple personalities. I think he has a bit of sense of humor there, but
well, at the same time, he's totally serious. Yeah.
But he's totally serious, mm-hmm. And his point was that that consciousness, being this kind of larger thing in which everything exists, we are alters or split offs of consciousness, and I think the implication was that it's through our own understanding of our own minds as the interface with larger consciousness, with the cosmic, with others, that we're able to I think, even perceive and get to a greater understanding of the fact that physicalism and materialism ain't all there is. And that, all of the laws that we observe in science are observed through the mind, and are even subject to change by mere fact of being an observer of certain phenomena. So that was an interesting kind of way of looking at things, and opened up my my own sort of thinking on it a little bit. In addition to the cosmic panpsychism idea, which maybe we can get into a little bit at some point as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually, so far in the book, I think that's been the coolest part of it. Like, the coolest idea is this idea of like individualized consciousness as like a split off, dissociated alter of a larger, all-encompassing consciousness. And of course, so he's got several lines of argumentation to hold it all together. But the basic idea being that the universe must be on some level, one universe. It must be a unity, and this gels with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics of the world as one entangled system. As the universe itself as the closed system, and that the quantum equations will only work on a closed system. And so you have to look at the world as a unified, one thing, whatever that is. And so you'll have quantum physicists who say, oh, well, that's the quantum field, or M-brain theorists, saying it's the whatever a brain is. And then, but Kastrup saying, well, what if those objects of thought that these physicists and theorists are thinking about, what if that one thing is universal consciousness? And it's like, well, then how do we explain the fact that the strong intuition that we all have, that we are inhabiting one world with other beings, with other things, with their own experiences? It's like, how does that? How do we gel that? How do we make that all fit? It's that well, there is a phenomenon that we're aware of within consciousness, within our own minds, within other minds, and that is dissociation. And it's not, and it applies to everyone. Like, dissociation applies to everyone, not just in the extreme cases of DID, dissociative identity disorder, or used to be called MPD, multiple personality, where you actually have different, unique personalities within one consciousness unit. Well, just as an aside, I think that's interesting. I like that approach because it's using the same approach that the intelligent design people use, and that Darwin himself used, which is looking to actual known phenomena, actual known causes for a different, for something that you're trying to find the answer for. So it's okay, well, what are the possible explanations for this? Well, let's look at the things that we already know, or that we already have some experience of. So in the intelligent design case, it's oh, well, we know that minds produce codes, and we don't know of any codes that aren't produced by minds. So it seems reasonable to at least hypothesize that the code that the DNA code is produced by a mind, or that was. So there's a similar style of argumentation going on here. It's well, so we have these separated bits, separated units of consciousness that we seem to be interacting with. Whether it's our friends and family, or our dogs, or amoeba, there seems to be these unified wholes that are interacting with each other in some way, and they all seem to have their own center of experience, their own subjective self. Well, what's an analogy that can be made? Well, if you look at one individual human mind, that mind can fragment, can dissociate into parts. And well, what's dissociation? Well, in dissociation, you can have different alters that are not aware of each other. Also, you can have alters that are aware of each other at some times, but the boundaries, there are boundaries that get put up and that get separated, and it seems very malleable. The experience of consciousness and identity, on that level, seems malleable. Well, it is malleable just from our own experience, and there are dissociated parts even in normal psychology where it can be just something that you haven't thought about but that's still influencing you, or something that you're not consciously aware of that's influencing you. And we talked about this in First Sight, our discussions on First Sight, about all of the unconscious like mentation or cognition or feeling that goes on, or motivations that influence our behaviors in ways that we're not consciously aware of. All these concepts and experiences are related, and that dissociative model is a really clever way of looking at it. You've got one like universal consciousness that splits into just this multiplicity of individual units that are part of the whole, but with boundaries around them. And like I think Kastrup might say that those boundaries are like our physical bodies. It's like that's how we perceive those boundaries. It's like I'm a we're all parts of the same dissociated whole, but our experience of each other is our experience of those dissociated boundaries, and that's what gives the appearance of separation. So it's a real separation on the one hand, but on a higher level there's a connection that is like operative. And that, like, there's even like an analogy to be made in like quantum mechanics. And I don't like talking about quantum mechanics because I'm not a physicist, and so I'm always afraid that I'm going to say something stupid, which is inevitable. But it's like there's that's a similar sort of thing going on when you look at quantum mechanics, where there's this first of all, like I said, in that at least one interpretation of quantum mechanics, the universe itself is a unified, like irreducible, like entangled whole, one thing, and the interactions among any of the parts in that closed system they're all influencing each other all the time. So it's this like interactive, like related, relativistic, but not in the Einstein sense, like universe where everything influences and affects everything else. So you've got, on the one hand, everything's connected and influencing everything else, but on the other hand, you have any individualized part that can be analyzed as a whole in and of itself, like a part of the whole. And so one of those parts will be the system, and one of those parts will be the measurement device, and they're interacting in such a way, but they're also interacting with everything else. At least that's my understanding of one interpretation of quantum mechanics. So any of the physicists can always correct me or tell me I'm wrong. But yeah, so I just think that idea is cool.
And I also wanted to touch on the idea of dissociation as being kind of a model for how the universe exists, because when you read it and you get the sense that this, because the model exists to explain a very pathological condition that is rooted in trauma. So I mean, that right there, you're like, oh, you're starting to think about the universe in terms of like, what did they do to you, universe? But really the real value of what he shows in that chapter, or in the chapters that he discusses the dissociative model, is that it is possible that is, as a fact, that does exist. There are different, you can dissociate and have multiple forms of consciousness in one, unified quote unquote consciousness. So then, you show empirically that is possible. And so then now you've established the grounds that you can extrapolate that out and beyond. And when you do, and you remove the pathological, veneer that surrounds DID, then you can see that it's not human mind that's dissociating. You're talking about a cosmic mind. And then when like you were saying, Harrison, about just all of the different ways that the universe manifests, all the matter, all of the quarks and protons and everything, you find a place for all of those things within a creative aspect of a mind that encompasses all of creation. And so it's like, why do these things exist? Well, it's like, why not? Why do humans, with our minds, why do we do things? We do things, I mean, there's a million different reasons why we do things, but a lot of the times it can be traced back to curiosity, to learning, to just tinkering with things. In our creative capacity as conscious subjects, we create things. I mean, we create just the amount of of gadgets that have emerged in the last 20 years is just a drop in the bucket in terms of, the existence of the entire universe. And when you think about the entire universe of existing within a mind and, all of these different dissociated parts of that mind, you get an idea of the kind of creativity that would help explain things like the fine-tuning problem, why the universe seems to exist in such a perfect way that life is even possible. Well, maybe the reason that we have different life forms, all these different genetically coded beings that are, geared towards this or that, is because this mind and all of its, dissociated parts want to manifest. That's their goal. The parts of mind wants to manifest in the cosmos, in the material world, in order to do something, to learn, to, just to play around, to know what it's like to be a bat, or to know what it's like to be a squirrel, or what it's like to be a human. I mean, because that's one of the things that he brings up in the book quite a bit, is that when you're talking about experience, you're always talking about what it's like to be something. And as humans, we have such a desire to know what it's like to be this, or we have so much curiosity in terms of, reading about foreign lands, reading about the stars, reading about we always want to know what it's like. What would it be like to be rich? Or, what's it like to be poor? Well, what if the cosmic mind has a similar sort of desire? What if in some way that's why the universe exists?
Corey, when you were saying all that and you evoked creation, I was thinking about the Legend of the Fall. I was thinking about Adam and Eve as these dissociated, fallen people, or representative, or mythological, or kind of representations of early man, or some aspect of man that lost part of their connection to a cosmic awareness, or cosmic mind. And that part of the significance of that story, as we look at where we are today, is the grappling, the striving towards regaining whatever awareness it was that they had prior to their fall. And it seems to me, since everything more or less exists in the mind, so to say, and we can make distinctions about that, but let's say that for all intents and purposes, that it's this striving to understand what the mind is, what we're capable of connecting to, in using our imaginations, in trying out all these different hypotheses and probabilities, and combining it with what we know through science, and what we're now coming to understand about where neo-Darwinism fails. What is our place? What is a true evolution? If neo-Darwinism was incorrect, and in fact, there was some element of intelligent design that went into putting us together, what was the purpose for that design? And it's in the journey, I think, of looking at all those things that we come closer to approaching, hopefully, the road to getting back to where we were before the fall. I mean, that sounds kind of nice and prosaic, but that's what comes to mind. There's no pun intended. This journey in understanding our connection to a cosmic mind, or information field, or how it is that we are these kind of alters or dissociated beings that have some limitation. This is the work. Just like getting healthy or working out, it's a painful. It's a work in progress. You don't gain strength, to use a very materialist analogy, by sitting on a couch. You do it by exercising. So is there a faculty for the mind, for the growth of the mind, for the growth of a connection to a cosmic mind that comes in contemplating these very questions and ideas.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to. You brought up that brought to mind the fall for you, and like to me, it brought up a similar idea. All the myths about the God that is dismembered, and like creation somehow like forms out of the dismembered members of the dismembered God, and like I think Orion is one, maybe it's Osiris, but I get my Egyptian gods mixed up. But this idea of like the divine, ultimate being that then like gets split up into parts, and creation comes forth out of those parts, or something, some kind of creation comes forth out of those parts. That I think is like a good mythological representation of this like dissociation of consciousness too. Just this idea, like of the universal whole splitting up into multiple parts. Of course, with that myth, it's probably, I think it's true on multiple levels. If this dissociative thing is true, it's true on that level. It's also probably true on the level of the origin of the representations of certain gods as being originally like cometary encounters, where like the ancients saw these like violent and catastrophic like encounters with comets that came much closer like to, well, actually interacted with Earth and its atmosphere and the people on it, and just did a lot of destruction, more than we have any reference to now, like the Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago. But because so true on the level of there were actual events that, well, I'll just give a bit of the background. It's probable, based on a lot of researchers, that in ancient times there were many encounters with comets, and so there was this like really spectacular display in the sky of this comet, and those comets were viewed as gods and named after God, or named as gods, and that the interactions and the things viewable in the heavens were then like encoded in mythological form. So the breakup of a god into many parts could have been, and seems to have been, that image seems to have found its place, or found its origin in like the breakup of a massive comet, and maybe the destruction that it caused, and then the new birth, the new life that came out of that destruction. And so I think there are several ways of looking at it, but they all kind of relate, because that experience of like a massive like heavenly body undergoing this spectacular like bright display of destruction and dismemberment, and then the destruction caused on parts of the earth, and the catastrophe, and like the amount of death and struggle and suffering that caused, and then the effort that humanity must have gone through to reestablish itself, to reform itself. All of the emotions and like just the narrative of that is like it in and of itself is a perfect metaphor, I think, of this like more cosmic metaphysical process. It's like here is like the ultimate universal consciousness that undergoes like a dissection of itself to enter the world that we experience as the world of suffering, of like pain, of limitation, of all of the struggles that we go through in our lives, and then the building, and then building out of that something, using like all of the evils of the world and all of the evils of experience to then create something better and good out of that, to then like reconnect, to like with the example of the fall, to get closer and to make those connections again with higher levels of consciousness and higher levels of connection between those dissociative parts. It's like that seems like a really good story, on no matter how you look at it. And it can apply on the earthly historical level, the metaphysical cosmic level, but also like in the individual. And this is it's also in the Christian story of the God that becomes a man to enter the world of suffering and to go through, to experience it all, and to then ascend, to reascend to that original place of divinity, with the experience in his pocket, essentially. And a horrible experience, just like that's what life is. Life is a horrible experience. It's also a beautiful experience. It's both. but it can those scales can be tilted one way or the other. And in any given life, you can have the extremes, and so in one that whole structure can apply to any individual too. It's like you gave the extreme example of actual dissociative identity disorder, or just the disintegrations and fragmentations of the human mind that an encounter with just extreme evil can bring about. Evil in oneself and evil in those around you. It's like that trauma can just destroy a person. But the beauty in that is that out of those experiences there is the possibility of rebirth, of putting together oneself again, and of creating something new, and even of like leaving aside the trauma aspect, there is just that possibility now of, given all of those like conditions of the world, like here's the nature of the world, and now go and do your thing. We have now the possibility, looking at it from those terms, of seeing the world as a place of like infinite potential and infinite possibilities, and and despite our own limitations, but by becoming aware of our own limitations, of learning to either utilize or transcend those limitations. And we don't know what the limits of that process can be, how many limitations we can overcome, how many like hacks we can put into ourselves in the universe. It's like, oh well, here's what we once considered an obstacle that cannot be overcome. It's like just an inherent limitation. It's like, well, if we can change our perspectives on that, that might not become it might not be a limitation anymore. We might be able to overcome that limitation. And then so this view of the world, it can open up those possibilities. And when you're living in a world where not only is it possible to actualize any of these different potentials, actualize any of these different possibilities, but it can be, but it is in a certain direction too. Because if you just have possibilities and none of them are better than any other possibility, then it's just arbitrary. It doesn't matter which choice you make. It doesn't matter what happens to you. It doesn't matter if what happens to you is horrible past anything you can imagine, or if it's like unbelievably good. Those have no distinction. There's just A, B, C, D, E, F, on to infinity. It's just each option has its own, has the same weight. But we seem to live in a universe where things are weighted. And so part of that process of all these unlimited possibilities is to find the ones that are most valuable and most important and most meaningful, and then actually bringing that into existence. Mm-hmm. And so you can see that as this kind of like divine, like universal drama of you in relation to everything else, but also you in relation to like the totality of everything else, which you can perceive as God or a cosmic mind or whatever you want. Mm-hmm. But it's this, you're placed in the middle of this, like, it's just, well, I don't even have the words to describe it, because it's just so immense and like immaculate. It's like it's like the grandest story, or the best movie, or the best video game, but none of those do justice to the reality of like the universe that we live in, and the possibilities that are opened up by living within this cosmic mind, the facets of which we can't even comprehend.
Yeah, that reminds me. I was reading a book. I can't remember the author, but I think he was a biblical scholar, and he was discussing. If I could just remember the name of the book, I believe it's The Creation of the Bible and the Talmud. Surpassing Wonder is what it's called. Surpassing Wonder, and that's those two words, surpassing wonder, is the impression that I'm picking up, because he talks about it in the book. He's a scholar, and he's done his research, spent years and years researching these things, and he says, he just comes right out and says that when you're discussing these religious ideas, you can't do it in just this dry, scholarly way. When you're talking about it, you bubble up, and you are exuberant at these concepts. And he says, I will not apologize for that, because that is the nature of this way of seeing the universe. which in and of itself is, you know, some sort of you know, a practical consideration to keep in mind, whether, you know, if you're looking at the universe in ways that brings joy, or you're looking at the universe in ways that brings, you know, nihilism and, you know, self-hatred and just rejection. But yeah, that's what I thought when you were discussing that. And another thing that I thought was this hypothesis, theory, this way of seeing the world explains a number of things that the mainstream physicalist account doesn't. And one of them that it explains is, and probably the most important thing, is consciousness, experience, why we have experience. I mean, if you can't explain that in your worldview, then you're missing out on, you're losing your life, essentially. You know, like Socrates said, a life not examined is a life not worth living. And if you don't, you know, if you're not examining your experience, if you're not able to account for it, to really embrace it in a way that is, you know, that brings human dignity, then there's a problem. And that's another thing that it solves, that this way of seeing the world solves, is the problem of human dignity. Because it restores the spark of the divine to human life, but not just human life, to all of existence. Everything gains this kind of a glimmer, a sparkle of creativity and of the love of like a doting creator, you know, in some way, that there was this unbelievable miracle that created life, that created the universe, that was before the universe, that, you know, is outside, all-encompassing of the universe. And another is that it takes, you know, intelligent design out of the realm of, it was, you know, Jehovah or Yahweh, or it was aliens, or it's like intelligence in general is not specific to a certain theory. You know, the intelligence is just part and parcel of the entire universe. Intelligent design, so therefore you would expect to see intelligent design. That would just be a matter of fact, a matter of course. If the universe is conscious, exists within consciousness to varying degrees, you're going to imagine there's going to be different kinds of consciousness creating different things for different purposes, possibly at cross purposes. You know, you don't know, but you know, it explains a number of different things in a way that is holistic. It accounts for human dignity. It accounts for the intelligence that you see in the universe, and it also doesn't try and go back to scientific revolution ways of conceiving of God, which is the biggest problem. Because when Nietzsche, you know, as Jordan Peterson says, Nietzsche proclaimed, you know, God is dead and we have killed him, and he was right. That God is dead. You can't. I mean, unfortunately, he's not coming back. There's so many problems. There are so many problems with the Judeo-Christian way of conceiving the universe. And not just that, but real problems that came when humans started confronting the world exactly as it is, and not, you know, and just saying, you know, just to hell with it, to hell with whatever I'm supposed to believe. I just want to know what is out there. And I want to be able to predict what's going to happen. I want to be able to control our fate. We want to be able to create. We want to be able to we want to learn everything that we possibly can. Well, the problem is that when you're doing that, you just are bound to create nihilism. Because if you just question everything, you're bound to come up to a point of nihilism. You're bound to come to a point of, you know, the dark night of the soul. And it's probably just a part and parcel of the evolution, for lack of a better word, of a group of people, of a species that embarks on such a thing. You're going to, you know, question all of your most cherished beliefs. You're going to have to toss away a lot of the things that you hoped were true. And for a lot of people who are, you know, like materialists or atheists, I think, you know, a lot of them, years ago, and even probably still today, that they still believe that they are committing themselves to the truth. And that they can, you know, to the best of their ability, this is the truth, this is all we can prove. Well, it's not true. You know, there's a number of problems with it. One, like, you know, for one problem is that the entire dichotomy of mind and matter that was created in order to pursue this the scientific agenda without the church crushing you because you can't question all these problems. You're like, okay, so church, you get to keep mind, and we'll take the matter. Well, that was problematic. It left, like Kastrup points out, it left a huge rift in our ability to understand the world because, as we've said before, mind and matter are not a dichotomy. Like, mind and matter are not hot and cold. Mind and matter are not life and death. Mind and matter are not, success and failure. Mind is like the parent of matter, essentially, because matter is an abstract concept. So you can't use the abstract concept of matter to explain mind because it doesn't work like that. As Kastrup points out, there's an epistemic symmetry that exists between dichotomies. They have to be part of, in order to, they have to basically pass a test. If I can see that this person is alive, then I know that they're not dead. That's it. And the problem is that mind and matter don't work that way. There's extra inferential steps that you have to take in order to understand mind and matter. So if I feel a negative emotion, that doesn't mean that there's a negative electron. You know what I mean? You just can't. They don't work. They don't work like that. Experience and matter don't exist in the same realm of epistemic symmetry. And so once you do away with that, then you're freed, like we've been discussing, to conceptualize of the universe in a way that matter is put back into the place where it belongs and where it matters. Harrison, I saw you. You're like, say it. Go ahead.
Well, I was actually going to say something else, but I won't because it would be totally un-PC.
Say it.
No, I refuse. But I think this is a good point to just point out, we were talking a bit earlier, you and me, Corey, about Kastrup's book, and just to make clear that there are definitely things in the book that I don't agree with. And some arguments that I don't think are, or quite as well argued as they could be, and some things that I don't agree with. But a lot of the conclusions that he comes to are things that I can pretty much get behind. But some of the ways that he gets there, I'm not quite sure about. So maybe just really quickly, I'm going to go through a couple of them. We might do another show at some point and look more deeply at this. But one, because you mentioned this way of looking at the world opening up a new understanding of how we might conceptualize intelligent design, for instance. One downside of the book, I think, is that at a few points, Kastrup presupposes just presupposes neo-Darwinism as an accurate description of evolution, and kind of uses some evolutionary arguments to make some points. And I don't think that's the best way of going about it, just because I don't think those arguments actually work. I don't think you can presuppose a neo-Darwinian view of the world, especially because neo-Darwinism, as it has become and as it is now, is an exemplification of the materialist philosophy that is strangled science and philosophy to one degree or another for the last several hundred years. So just to keep that in mind, and it may be because, he points out at various points in the book, all of these chapters were originally papers that he had published in peer-reviewed journals. And so, at one point he says, he includes in a note, keep in mind, I was writing this for this journal, so I was open about this question, whether it was one or the other. I do think it's one and not the other, but, for the purposes of this journal, I couldn't say that explicitly. So it could be that, he's using it as an argumentation, like a rhetorical point. It's look what we can conclude from even the Darwinian perspective. I'm not sure if that's his actual mindset or not, but regardless, there are some points that he makes based on evolutionary arguments that I don't think are valid. Like I said, we can get into those maybe at another time, but I do think that, ironically or not, that the final picture he comes to actually creates a much better ground for something like intelligent design than neo-Darwinism. So I thought that was interesting. But one other thing, or maybe two other things that I have issue with is kind of a basic epistemological starting point, and also what he says about pan-experientialism or panpsychism. So when he's going through the various options like physicalism, there's no like the absolute basic bits of the universe, basic stuff of the universe is matter. It is inanimate, describable by these mathematical properties and values, and there's no consciousness in it. There's no experience in it. But he gives another example, and that's panpsychism. So like panpsychists or micro experientialists or micropsychists, like there's various terminologies for these, but all being the idea that there are some like ultimate and like small bits of matter that do have experience, either some or all of them. So like the pan-experientialists, like David Ray Griffin, would say that all subatomic particles have some degree of experience. Others would say, oh, well, only some ultimate bits have experience. And Kastrup himself, he gives the break-off point as being like organisms, so like from single-celled organisms up, essentially. Like they have some level of experience. Those are the dissociated parts. But what we perceive as like as the chemical world, from physical and chemical, from subatomic up to like molecules, those don't have experience. Those are like what he calls mind at large. That is like the field of consciousness that are basically expressions of thoughts of the universal mind, but themselves are not dissociative parts of the universal mind. That we just experience them. So they're kind of like just experiences of thoughts, which are excitations of that which experiences. But I don't think that's a necessary step. Who knows? Maybe he's right. But I'm at least at this point, I do think that I think that pan-experientialism, which he points out there's a problem with. So there's the problem with physicalism as the hard problem of consciousness, which comes about because of this false dichotomy between mind and matter. But there's also a problem with pan-experientialism, the idea that every little bit has some degree of consciousness. That, okay, so you've got all of these like atoms that have their own experience. So you put them together in some way, like you just jam them all together into the form of a tree or a rock or a human, and just somehow some of those will be conscious and some won't, or maybe all of them are. But it seems arbitrary. It's like, well, how do those things all combine in such a way as to produce like a higher grade of consciousness? There's no good explanation for that. I think he calls it like the subject combination problem. It's another problem in philosophy, and a problem with these systems in particular. But I think that problem would disappear if you just accepted the holistic view and basically viewed it as like there's this top-down dissociation, but there's also a bottom-up process going on too. Because like one thing that I haven't seen him address yet, and I haven't finished the book, but so at one point he does say that he thinks that like microorganisms, like single-celled organisms, do have their own kind of center of consciousness. They are themselves a dissociated part because they act as their own being essentially. And even when we observe them, they do seem to act like responsively. They seem to have like an intrinsic like knowledge of or experience of like the nature of interacting with the world, and like so they go towards food and away from harm and all that. It's like they seem to act like very simple beings, just like us, but on a very simple level. And even single-celled organisms are extremely complex, of course. But then when you take a human, we are made of like billions of cells, but we only have one center of consciousness. So I haven't seen him kind of talk about that distinction. It's like, so how can a single cell exist as its own thing and a multi-celled organism exist as its own thing if each of those cells doesn't have their own existence? And if each of those does have their own existence or their own experience, then you still have the problem. Well, how do they combine to create a higher form? Well, actually, you don't have the problem because they aren't combining to form a higher consciousness. That higher consciousness is a dissociation of the larger consciousness, but it is built out of like billions of smaller dissociated parts of that grand consciousness. So it's like there's a top a top-up process going on, or a bottom-up process going on, and a top-down process going on. So we are composed of like smaller parts that do contribute to our whole experience, and we are the top-down dissociation of a larger part. So there's two directions as opposed to just one. But still, I think you can still reconcile this with the view that everything at its root is consciousness, because we could be just the combination of like billions of very small dissociated bits of consciousness. But like but our own consciousness is kind of like encapsulating those holes, just as our own mind will encapsulate or bracket off the like dissociated parts in our own personalities, in our own psyches. There's something on like what we might call the physical level that's going on too. So we have so when you cut off your arm, it's like you are cutting off like a part of your own self, which is created to some degree out of consciousness. But like there are little bits of yourself that are missing now, that are gone, that are not, you're no longer whole in a sense. And so I think there is something essential about going down to those levels. And like I said, I would even go down further. I think that you could make an argument that that the smallest dissociated parts are subatomic particles, but that save that for another time. But this kind of relates to the last problem I had in the epistemic, epistemological thing. So how do we know? Like there are various points in the book where, especially when Kastrup's giving his arguments against like physicalism, where he brings up like the view of several philosophers and scientists that are what you could call like an anti-realist position, that all we experience are our own perceptions of reality. We don't actually experience reality itself. All we have to go on are our perceptions. And this argument goes back to Hume and Locke and Kant. And but the problem is, I think it's wrong. I think they're wrong. I don't think that that doesn't mean I think physicalism is right. I think that actually physicalism and this view of how we know the world are intimately tied. That the reason we have this view of how we know things as being only through our senses is actually comes out of like the same schools of thought and the same lines of thinking that led to materialism in the first place. So like some of the conclusions from Kant and from Hume, based on this theory of how we know things, of how we come to know things, so that we only have the images that like are projected on the screen of our consciousness to know anything by. And the conclusion of that, and this has been like a symptom of philosophy ever since, is that we therefore can't account for and can't justify the existence of other things. We can't account for the reality of causation, for instance, because all we see is one thing happening after another thing in our consciousness. There's nothing that like a series of time slices will. There's nothing in that series of time slices that will suggest to us or imply anything about the nature of causation, that there's something inherent about that first thing that actually causes the next thing to happen. And even up to like Santayana, who said, well, if we really look at this, we can't even justify like the existence to like in any sense of the past or the future. All we're left with is this slice of time. Like these slices one after the other, we can't justify our memories or the past or the existence of the past, and we can't justify the idea that there's any kind of potential future even. But all of these seem to be vastly like not only counterintuitive but like self-defeating, because if we can't justify anything, if we can't justify any of these things, we have no business talking about them at all. We have no business talking about, well, what's the nature of the world, because we can't even, we have no reason for thinking that anything exists outside of ourselves, whether it's consciousness or matter or whatever, because of this view of the way in which we perceive and know. And but the where I'm going with this is that that view of that epistemology is wrong-headed. Like, I think that Locke and Hume made errors when they were doing that, and I think the best person that identified those errors was Whitehead, because like he pointed out that even when you take that position, it's like, okay, I see like this blue field or whatever, which is the sky. I see this blue sky. All I have is is the perception of that blue sky. That's the only thing that I can actually know, is that I'm experiencing that blueness. But there's something that's presupposed in that statement, because and Whitehead finds it like in Hume. Hume says that, and I know the blue by my eyes. And I feel by my limbs, and there's always something that he's aware of that he doesn't acknowledge, and that is that he is sensing with his sense organs. And no one can escape that. The reason they see a blue sky is because of their eyes. Their eyes are playing some kind of integral, essential part in the sight, in the sight of the blue. It's through the eyes. It's not as if, you could go further, and some maybe have, but it doesn't really make much sense to think, all I am is a screen of consciousness, and my body doesn't exist, and my eyes don't exist. It's like the thought that actually gets you there is the acknowledgement that, okay, I see with my eyes, but can I trust the images that my eyes are causing? There's a presupposition that our senses, it's called sense perception for a reason. It's because the only reason we've had these philosophies is because of people unconsciously or implicitly recognizing that they are experiencing the world through their senses. That is, their consciousness is aware of and is causally affected in some way by the senses of their bodies, by their physical bodies. On some level, they are aware of their physical bodies and the reality, in some sense, of their bodies. Now, what the nature is of the bodies, we don't know, or you can't say just right off the bat. That's something to then be discussed or really looked into. But another thing about perception that Whitehead says, it's like, what's going on then when we see something? Okay, yeah, we're seeing an image of blue using our eyes, by means of our eyes. We have an awareness of our eyes as causing, in some sense, that perception. So what Whitehead said is that the basis of perception isn't perception. It's not the images we see. The most basic level of perception is the perception or the experience of what he calls causal efficacy. We on the most basic level, we have the experience of the efficacy of our eyes for doing something, of our ears for doing something. It's like, and when you have that, it's like the experience of causal efficacy is, when you're experiencing anything, it's that something is causing that perception. It's like when you can't have a perception of something if there's nothing that you're perceiving. There has to be some nature to the thing that you're perceiving. And of course, so Kastrup would say the nature of what you perceive is other consciousness, or the extrinsic appearance of those dissociative alters. But that is something else. You need a cause to have an effect. You need something causing the perception in order to have the perception. So in that sense, that's why I don't necessarily agree with some of the more I guess you could say more extreme statements of idealism that Kastrup makes, because at various points he'll say something that I think is just totally reasonable, which seems to kind of contradict other times when he'll say something that I perceive as less reasonable. But so that's why I say I usually kind of agree with him in the end, but there's just some ways getting there that I don't necessarily follow or agree with, because it's like all you have are your perceptions. Well, what is entailed by the idea of perception? It's that there is a perceiving subject and something that you are perceiving. There is reality on both ends of the spectrum, and using our higher level ability of thinking, we can come to various conclusions about the nature of the things that we're experiencing. The nature of or the idea that each of the people that I interact with are their own dissociated alters, but they are real in the sense that I am actually experiencing them. there's like the two sides of that equation are just as important: the experiencing subject and the thing that is being experienced. And I just don't think that that's made clear enough in Kastrup. I think Whitehead does a better job of that, but like I said, when it comes down to it, at the end, they usually kind of, or Kastrup usually kind of comes to a point where like our most basic intuitions about the world are justified. But just from his kind of what's the word? Well, extremely idealistic sense, in the sense of mind being everything and the only thing.
Right, and that is one of the dangers of idealism, isn't it? Too, that you end up kind of skirting the lines of solipsism. There's some solipsistic type attitudes and that kind of come along with that. The idea that the world all exists in a dream, like that that it's all just a dream, or it's all just I can't really know the world as it actually is, because it's like you said, I'm just a screen of perception. It's just I'm perception, and then the world out there is just who knows what it is. I see it's blue sky, but maybe it's not. And idealism in that way is, and we've discussed that on previous shows, that you can, when you're thinking about the world, you really have to be aware of, your kind of your presuppositions. And I think that was one of the points of the show, is to really flesh out some of the presuppositions behind idealism, behind physical reality, behind materialism, and to come to an idea of where they all belong, where they all hang in the balance, because that's the job of philosophy right there. And philosophy has its own role in life, just as anything else does. That when you're doing philosophy, you're just figuring out how things hang together. How does everything kind of hang together in your worldview? Whether it's on your personal life or it's in the big picture, just in the most cosmic picture that we've been discussing here, and kind of trying to debug little things, trying to see, well, this doesn't seem like it fits. Maybe this needs to be tweaked, but the physicalism as a way of viewing the world obviously still has its place. And like we were talking about before the show, I was like, the ground floor is what Kastrup points out, that the physicalist model accounts for correlations between brain activity and inner life, the fact that we all inhabit the same world, and that the dynamics of the world unfolds independently of whatever our wishes, and it's not just a dream. There's the law is the law for whatever reason, and we don't really know. We don't know why, but in this model, you can venture hypotheses as to why the physical world exists the way it does, according to some rational creation. Some way of actually establishing law.
Are you still talking about the physicalist view of these things?
I'm talking about incorporating the physicalist model into a broader idealistic model.
Okay. Yeah. So so Kastrup will account for all of those basic facts using the idealistic model. And so, correct me if I'm wrong. So what you're saying is that there's still a place for physicalism to some degree, in that limited sphere, or what are you actually saying about that?
The existence of all of the observations of science, basically that that the observations of science clearly they work. On a technical level. If you're just looking at it just purely on a technical level without philosophy, if you go to work tomorrow, you're going to act as though all of these things work. So I'm just on a hardcore common sense level, it's compatible. It's compatible. I mean, and it's not just compatible, but I mean the assumptions that go along with it are not compatible. But the facts in and of themselves of that. If I get in a car crash, the sodium azide pellets in my airbag compartment are going to they're going to get set on fire, and the nitrogen is going to be released, and the airbags are going to shoot out. And that's just that's chemists, scientists, technicians designed this, and it works. And unless there's a flaw somewhere, but by a law of nature, they're compelled to nitrogen is compelled to come out whence fire is, what however you want to view it. There's within a system, I think that just those facts have to be accepted. Just the technical side of nature has to be accepted, because I don't think that you can view the intellect, the mind, without the technical. I mean, what else is it doing besides the technical? What else do you work with a mind besides reality, besides the material, the technical, with your crafting? That's where all the fun is. That's the challenge. How do I get this to work this way? You have to figure it out.
So I think that the role of philosophy is to create a bigger picture in which to account for those facts and to make them make sense. And so where philosophy goes wrong is when it either can't account for those facts or doesn't account for them very well. It's the advantage of physicalism is that at least it acknowledges those facts, but there are other facts that it doesn't acknowledge, and there are other philosophies that can also account for those facts. The good thing about physicalism is that at least it got us this far, right? It was adequate for the job, for a job. It got a job done. It didn't get all the jobs done, and in fact, it hindered some other jobs from getting done. But it played its role, and now it can die a pleasant death, and it won't be so pleasant. And there will be other philosophies, hopefully, that will do just as good a job or a better job of accounting for those facts, so that the world still makes sense. Essentially, we're still living in an ordered world, and the most basic presuppositions and most basic intuitions about the world are still there, because otherwise we couldn't do anything. But that kind of that different the different way in which all those pieces are fitted, the different picture that they create is one that opens up more possibilities, and will account for the things that were neglected specifically by the physicalist view. So I think that's the advantage of taking a new look at philosophical systems, and looking at the options kind of on the table, and what they do entail, and the possibilities that open up as a result of them, and the problems that can be solved because of them, like the previous errors that can be put behind us, ideally. To come to just a better picture of the world, and therefore a better gives us a better ground from which to act in the world, and kind of opens up those new potential futures that maybe were closed off when we had a more limited view of the world, and a more limited philosophy of the nature of things.
Yeah, there's a danger between confusing comfortable thinking with clear thinking, and the physicalist model and the world that we live in. It's comfortable. Whether it's as crazy as it is, for a lot of people, it's still the comfortable way of viewing things, and so that's why we're glad that you tuned in today to hear the uncomfortable philosophy, something that a little more challenging. That's it for us this week. You have a great week. Go ahead and check out The Idea of the World if you haven't already, by Bernardo Kastrup. Support him. He's a really insightful and very interesting philosopher and computer engineer. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. See you next time.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.